Hi everyone, today we are talking about what exactly a technical director is, what are the skills involved, and of course, what it means to work for Pixar and how it might be different to most of us. I'm joined by Paul Kanyuk, a lead technical director at Pixar Animation Studio, who was working there for the last 14 years and involved in one of my favorite movies of all time, Ratatouille. His impressive resume also includes Cars, WALL-E, Up, Brave, and Finding Dory.
Basically, I started reading that book, which was all about writing shaders, something I had never heard of. I always thought graphics was something where you'd paint or sculpt. But the idea of using code to describe how light interacts with materials and how texture is put on, it just seemed like sorcery, and I really wanted to learn more.
I'm your host, Alexander Richter, and welcome to the 21 Artist Show, where we talk about how to grow in today's media industry in animation and visual effects, including personal development. If you want to find more content, go on alexanderrichtertd.com, subscribe to my YouTube channel, podcast, and email list, check out my mostly weekly blog, and support me by spreading the word and let people know about this content. Enjoy the show. I would like to kick it off with the first background question. Can you give us a brief history of your past days and how did you end up where you are now?
Sure, I'll try to keep it brief, but I've been at Pixar for almost 15 years now, so it's a long story. But let's go back to middle school. Played a lot of video games. Final Fantasy VII really changed my life. I really wanted to make nerdy computer graphics images, so I kind of set on a path to try to learn these skills. I ended up getting into the digital media design program at the University of Pennsylvania, where I thought I was going to do art. Despite the name, it's actually more of a computer science program. So I had to really go out of my way in college to find opportunities to do graphics, at least of the type I was interested in. And I actually got involved in the campus television station, UTV-13, where I became literally a technical director in the original meaning of the word. That is, someone who sits behind a monitor while a TV show is being shot and switches between cameras and presses buttons to add silly effects. So I did this for a little bit. That was not the job I was looking for. But one of the fortunate things about getting involved with the campus television station is I got involved with a group of students that wanted to make animated shorts, including a guy who was super influential in my life, Ray Forziati. He was a year older than me in my degree program. And he somehow knew about RenderMan, that is Pixar's rendering software. And he was saying, hey man, if you want to get into this industry, read this book. And it was the book Advanced RenderMan, which I have in my office. Let me get it real quick. So check out this book. Nobody should read this. This is very obsolete. This is from before the turn of the millennium. But this is by Tony Apodaca and Larry Gritz. Tony is still here at Pixar in our theme parks division. Larry is now at Sony, father of the open shading language standard. But basically, I started reading that book, which was all about writing shaders, something I had never heard of. I always thought graphics was something where you'd paint or sculpt. But the idea of using code to describe how light interacts with materials and how texture is put on, it just seemed like sorcery, and I really wanted to learn more. So I got very into shading after reading this book. But unfortunately, when I applied for jobs, this was now a sophomore in college, I got rejected from every internship I applied to, whether it was LucasArts or Pixar or ILM. So instead, I got a job on campus, and I was actually at the time doing a lot of psychology coursework, and I was looking for jobs in the psych lab, and one of the jobs required C programming. I was like, ooh, this is kind of a nerdy psych job, and it described a little bit of knowing how light interacted with materials in physics. So I got the job, and the professor was really interested in using computer graphics imagery to validate actual human psychological responses. Like, can you tell if the color of these spheres are the same in these lighting conditions, that kind of thing. So to be perfectly accurate, he didn't trust just RGB. This is Dr. Brainerd, by the way, in the Penn Color Science Lab. He didn't just trust RGB. He wanted 31 wavelengths He went from 400 nanometers to 700 nanometers. So it's like, no, none of this RGB renders. I want 31 numbers per pixel. Can you give me these images? And it's like, this is my chance to use RenderMan and use all the code and funky stuff I saw in this book. So I actually wrote a MATLAB program that would read reflectance data from this car reflectance database I found on Cornell's website and write out a different RenderMan shader for each wavelength. So I'd render the image 31 times and then put it through his program to get the image we'd use in the experiments. So I got really into car paint because that's actually one of the most well-studied materials out there with the most data online. And fast forward a year, when I'm applying to Pixar's internship program, here I am, like, they're asking me about what I work on. I'm telling them about this car paint project. Turns out that's when the movie Cars was in production. And the supervising technical director was really also into car paint. So we're talking about car paint for a long time and how it reacts to light, and how Ford Mystique was my favorite car paint because it had a view-dependent color. It was green at facing angles, purple at grazing angles. And that pretty much got me the job as an intern. So it actually was working in a psych lab, but that really got me the opportunity. So I was very lucky, suffice to say. And there's always a bit of luck to being able to break into this industry. So yeah, once I got the job as an intern, I worked on the film Cars, worked doing shading tools, as well as render optimization. Cars was the first Pixar film where ray tracing was a big part of it, which is amazing in this day and age that was even a big deal. You know, here we are talking about real-time ray tracing on the latest GPUs. And back then, the kind of stuff I was doing was like, occlusion renders were so expensive. Could we bake our occlusion and reuse it as we tweak it? Because it was too expensive to compute very often. So that was the kind of stuff I was working on, using 3D data structures to store occlusion data so that artists could reuse it from frame to frame. All technology that's woefully obsolete by now. But yeah, I got my start doing that. Went back to school, but got a full-time job after that. So then I came back full-time. So I was intern for 6 months, went back to school, came back, and I was still working on Cars. It takes that long to make a film. I didn't realize it at the time, but yeah, again, render optimization. But right around the end of Cars was when Ratatouille first realized they needed a lot of crowds in the film. And this is, if you recall of the era, this is right around when Lord of the Rings, the Return of the King came out. So everyone was talking about massive. Everyone was talking about crowd simulation. And Pixar was one of the early animation studios to pick up massive for use in crowds. And of course, no one knew how it worked. And I was a new guy. So like, hey, how about you learn massive? So I was one of a few people that picked up the tool. And on Rat, I got a chance to basically create brains for our rat agents that we would then put in shots and do crowd simulations for. So for a number of years, I was doing crowd brain design, which is a weird concept, but it's kind of like robotics, but for animated characters. And I did that for a number of years, but as often happens, any pipeline you create becomes obsolete in a few years. And as great as our crowd massive pipeline was, by the time we got to Brave, all of our animation software had changed. We moved from our old legacy Marionette system to our modern Presto system, which pretty much completely wiped out the crowd pipeline. So then I started from scratch, basically working on a new crowd pipeline for the studio on Brave. That's been something we've been building over the years. We've since incorporated Houdini into the pipeline. We've now have a USD in the system. We've done path tracing. Moral of the story is are now rewriting the software again. So we've gone through many generations of software in the time. I've been mostly working with crowd simulation. I've gone from being an individual artist working on shots to leading teams. I led a crowds team on Brave. I supervised the crowds team on Finding Dory, Incredibles 2, and now onwards. So it's my fourth time being a crowd supervisor. But one of my favorite things about the gig is after being a supervisor, I get to go back doing nerdy pipeline development. So there's always kind of a, almost a rhythm or seasons at Pixar where you get a chance to lead a team or work on shots, and then you get a chance to make the tools better after that and rethink the assumptions you made. So it's never the same twice. And yeah, it's a fun gig.
Kids, that was the short version of Paul's history, by the way.
Yeah, that was just off the top of my head. I focused a lot on the internship because I know that's what a lot of people are interested in, how to get in the door.
No, it's amazing. No, I sometimes have to think about the timeline while you talk. Like it's kind of like when you brought up Lord of the Rings, I was kind of like, 2099, something like that.
Yeah, it was around 2003 is when Return of the King came out. Ratatouille was 2006. So if you think about when we were making Ratatouille, we were all watching Lord of the Rings and we're going, oh my God, look at all that awesome stuff.
Like one thing I always have, and I mean, we just kicking it off, it's like about technical directing and stuff like that. And you already described like a little bit like your career, you're more focused in crowd. But one thing I personally always have is I have this problem if I go somewhere and I have to describe it to people who are not part of the industry. Like, you go to a party, someone, people like, what you do? So what is your answer you normally bring in when you try to describe your job? Like what would you tell people who are not artists, who are not 3D or something like that?
Yeah. So if I only have one word, I choose animator. That's not correct. I know that's not correct. I am not a character animator, but at the end of the day, I am making characters move. I'm just doing so using technical tricks as opposed to keyframe animation. Actually, I will keyframe animate if I have to. I'm not great at it. But at the end of the day, I make characters move. But that doesn't describe the big picture. Like we're talking about, I spend way more time on pipeline than shot work. And how do you describe pipeline to someone? So basically, if I have a little more chance to describe my job, I say I both create the tools that we use at Pixar to create crowds of characters, and I use the tools to create crowds of characters. So I'm both an engineer, creating the tool set, and an artist using the tool set. That's one of the cool things I think about a technical director is that you're not exclusively in software engineering and you're not exclusively in shop production, depending on the studio, of course, but there's different nuances. But in general, you have the ability to span the spectrum from tool creation to using the tools and doing art.
Would it be the same way how you would describe like for yourself, like what's your exactly responsibility in a project? If you would be like in a broad sense, of course, in this case, like we're not talking about specific things, but if you would describe your role in a team.
So these days, my role is more supervising. So at the very beginning, first thing I do is watch the film, look at the storyboards and figure out how many crowd shots are there, how difficult they are, and what's going to be the budget. So I start the process actually doing more of a producer level role, but for crowds. And then once I've specified what the production needs, I also specify what technology needs to be created, which both involves working with our software engineering department, but more often than not is start working on it myself. So it's kind of funny. Like I put on one hat, I'm a producer. Take off that hat, I'm an engineer. Take off that hat, I'm an artist. But fortunately, it's not just me the entire time. About a year out, I start getting my first TD, first animator. And one of the things we have to do is figure out, all right, with a single animator, what are the most useful animation clips that are going to be useful for the crowd scene? If you're working on Ratatouille, that's going to be a running rat. You're going to want rat runs. If it's Finding Dory, you're going to want fish swimming, so sort of create your key locomotion clips. But then you start adding specificity on top of that. We also go shopping for animation from old shows to see if, hey, we've done walking pedestrians before. Maybe we can try to dig some of that up. Of course, technology changes. We got to do a lot of work to bring it over. So, early on, we do that sort of pre-production, do your general reusable animation, your main crowd's technology. And then as shop production ramps up, our first client is layout. Our layout department, which is essentially previs in feature film animation, needs some representation of the crowds. So we work with them just to find out how detailed or not detailed they want to go. A lot of films these days, I've been doing traffic, so many scenes, like you think about Incredibles 2, Helen, on the motorcycle weaving between traffic, Finding Dory, that shot going on roads. I feel like I'm doing a lot of cars these days. And that's something that layout needs an accurate representation to actually shoot around. So we work with layout to do crowd choreography. And then as soon as it's done in layout, then we have to hit our rough animation sequence blocking. So then we start working that. And then it goes down further and further. At peak, we probably have about usually 5 technical directors on the crowd's tech side and about 10 animators at peak. But for most of the time, it's me on tech and a single crowd's animation soup. And then it ramps up and down from there.
Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting definition, because I always say, like, if someone asks me, like in professional sense, I always say it's kind of like I make things easier and I make things possible. And this is kind of the pipeline tool aspect, and the second part is then always the development aspect, like where you kind of create something out of nothing. Either it's just easier because it's, for example, there are maybe some crowd simulation, but you can create a tool which is better performant, or you create something that's not even existing and something like that. So this is also like, so I think like you align with a lot of how I define that position in a lot of sense, kind of like it's also like multiple hats. It's not like just your technical director and your thing is one thing at all and that's it, kind of. So
yeah, actually along those lines of tool creation, at least the crowd pipeline at Pixar, we design it such that layout artists and animators can use it, in particular layout artists. So like they are kind of our first client of the show, and there's a whole lot of work it takes to get a show up and running so that a layout artist has a very easy experience and could, do whatever they want. So there's definitely like a huge trade-off. We spend a lot of effort to make the pipeline robust enough so that a layout artist doesn't even know how complicated it is. But it's also a trade-off. There's only a few specialists at the studio who know how to set up the crowd pipeline. And now that, USD is open source, other studios want to do crowds the same way we're doing. And we're like, oh, no, it's really hard to set up. So it's actually making us rethink how complicated it is. So we think it's in a good space right now for us, but we want to make it better now that we're more and more of the community is going open source.
I would be interesting for me is like, and I think also for someone who is like trying to understand this position, besides the definition, is like, can you sum up like a day? Can you break down a day? Maybe less of the supervising part, more of the like traditional technical directing day, which you had maybe in the past or have still now, where you can a little bit describe of, if you can break it up in like 8 hours, or what would be the typical like steps you will go through the day, and what would be the typical responsibilities you have. So someone who's like, I want to understand this position, is like, what is this involved? Is it scripting? Is it meeting? Is it whatever, So this is like the question here.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think one of the great things about the job is no 2 days are the same, but I'll give you an example of a day. I often find the rhythm of the day is dictated by the render farm. So the evening, the render farm is packed with all the images we're computing. Come the morning, everyone sees their work and there's going to be problems. So every morning, a bunch of emails go out. Why do all my crowds have white hair? Why is this render out of memory? Why is the set in front of camera? Where did the prop go that I added last night? And so I feel like the morning is a little bit of triage for what went wrong last night. I've gotten pretty good at triage, but I think that's common for any TD anywhere, is a little bit of triage. One of the great things about a good source control and check in, check out, publish system is there's usually a paper trail. And specifically when I work with animators, and like, oh my God, I added this. And like, all right, let's look in, we use Perforce for source control. I look in the Perforce logs, like, well, it was out of camera. So the auto pruning system removed it. You got to move it into camera within the day. Otherwise it gets pruned by the next day, something like that will happen. So there's early morning triage. The other thing I always do is we have a database system we call Traction for tracking fixes and shot work. Shotgun is the common one used in industry. we have a version called Traction. So I'll look at my Traction/Shotgun and see what fixes are assigned to me. And then, I marked this ready. That means I had kicked a render off. I'll look at my renders and close any fixes. So I usually try to get the database, up and running. But very soon, I feel like morning brains are the best. I usually try to do a bit of coding in the morning of some sort. Whatever project I've been thinking about, I want to try to get ahead of that, such that before lunchtime, I've done at least some coding. Let's say I'm creating a tool to, make some job and layout easier. I'll try to get that done. And then if there's anything I'm waiting on someone else's feedback for, I want to get the emails out to make sure that they're commenting on the job. I get lunch and send a render before lunch, because you don't want to take a lunch break without the machines working for you. So get a render on the farm, testing something, come back from lunch. And then one thing I try to do is stop by other folks' office. One of the great things about Pixar is we're all in the same building. It's not a very fragmented outsourced studio. So if someone's having a problem or someone on my team, I'm not sure where they're at, I do like to make my rounds. So, after lunch, I'll drop by people's office, see, hey, how you doing? And usually I find out a lot by talking to people that just didn't make it into the email. Yeah. And the average day will have probably had at least one meeting by this point, sometimes two, depending on the day. That helps break it up. I find some of the worst, repetitive stress injury I've ever gotten is when I've had no meetings and all desk time. So I actually appreciate a couple meetings during the day to break things up. Let's say I did fixes, checked on renders. I would say more often than not, what I do is Python work, when I'm doing technical development. But when I'm doing shot work, ideally, I'm not doing any coding. Early on, I used to think I can do a script for everything. But as I've gotten more experience in the industry, I try to stick to what the tools can do already until I have to deviate. I'm not trying to prove anything by saying, I can create a script to do that. No. Ideally, there's as little infrastructure and pipeline as possible. So I think on a good day, I actually do zero coding, but most days are not good days. So I do a lot of coding, a lot of programming, a lot of scripting, a lot of debugging. But I think the goal is to have it such that this isn't really required. The system just works. But so that was a very vague, hand-wavy description of the day. But suffice to say, before the end of the day, I get more renders on the farm.
For example, you mentioned coding, Python and stuff like that. So for you, this is part of your job.
Yeah. So it happens in there's a rhythm to it. Like when I'm in pre-production, let's say, I'll just use a practical example on Incredibles 2. This is one of the first films where for the crowds department, we were using motion capture to try to do some crowd animation. We had done it on Coco. We're trying it on Incredibles 2, and there are super big problems with that pipeline. We were only really seeing a skeleton on a grid when doing the capture. Then we'd try putting it on a character. I'm like, that looks awful. If we had known what it looked like on our character, we wouldn't have spent all this time. And one of the tricky things is our proprietary animation software doesn't just work with off-the-shelf mocap tools. So what we had to do is create some infrastructure to allow that streaming Vicon data to play back on real time on one of our rigs with accurate retargeting at capture time, not as a post process. We called it the fast mocap stand-in. So I'm like, you want to know what? I'm going to dig into this. So part of it was literally just rigging, creating the necessary, prims and connections to make sure the transform data was going to the correct thing. And then sure enough, part A didn't fit into part B. Part B didn't fit into part C. So all right, now I need to create a snippet of Python that goes in here. And let me just do things as fastly as possible to make sure that this even works. So basically a proof of concept. So what I'll do is spend some time to make sure I'm not wasting my time to get to that fast proof of concept. All right, I've connected the dots. Then I've shown that it's working. We do a capture session. It's good. And I was like, all right, that was great, but this is a one-off hack for one character. How do we now generalize this? And I feel like that's a good time where I can start delegating and splitting up the task. It's like, all right, now that I know that this is a valid direction, we can have our intern work on generalizing this portion, and this person, maybe he can move that from Python to C++ so that it could run faster. So then I can kind of split it up better. But for my personal role, I tend to try to do the prototyping to make sure that we're going in a good place, and then we can generalize. So so that fast mocap stand, and that was a couple weeks of work. There's some ugly matrix math to how to figure out how to unscramble the matrices coming out of Vicon on one rig and then get onto our rig. And, a lot of debugging involved. When a matrix is wrong, like your character's just like some contorted mess. So you have to sort of like uncontort it to get the pieces fitting. And now you know what to do. Then you can generalize it for more characters. So that's an example of a sort of TD project that I did. But then later on, I'm also helping supervise the mocap shoots, deciding what to capture and also automate that process. A lot of what we're doing is taking something that could be done by hand and just making you not suffer through the tedium. Like a lot of times, if the question comes up like, man, can a machine do this? If you have that question, the answer is probably yes. And that's where you need a TD to help the machines do it for you.
I think this was a really good sentence. And I think this is also the reason why I chose to be a TD. It's kind of like, I kind of hated the repetition. And I kind of, even if it's not about programming or scripting itself, it's sometimes just to find a better solution is sometimes worth the while, like having this technical mind where you basically search for a better workflow, even if it's not involved in Python. I think this is also one of the driving factors I hear from you and also from me. It's and I did get this question a lot, like, do I have to know scripting? I always say yes. I would never say you have to be like a C++ crazy developer creating big software, but your reality and my reality basically prove that like you have to know Python. It's important to a base where you can do like prototyping, like you can do your scripts that automate processes. I think this is the baseline, and from that on you can always go higher. You can always go to the pipeline direction where you distributed modules and create classes and stuff like that. But this is like, I think this is like the best example of your reality. It's all exactly like mine. By the way, the one where you're kind of supervising mocap sounds very like the original definition of what we had of what is a technical director. So you kind of drift into that here and there, I would say.
Well, one fun thing I find about crowds is just talking to my friends elsewhere in the industry, there's a lot of overlap with virtual production, because we know how to use capture stages, because we're good about how to get animation on all forms of characters. We tend to then get involved in previs and virtual production where people want to try to scout out the set with iPads and such. So I've noticed this as well throughout the industry. So that's another hat we wear sometimes in crowds. And it does kind of get back to the original definition. I feel like that's the closest I get to live action. Is anytime we're doing virtual production stuff. It's like, whoa, it's like filmmaking. It's kind of interesting, or like live film. It's more of a performance, when you go that direction. It's kind of interesting.
True. Like one thing you just said before, I noticed myself is also being able to kind of determine the complexity, determine the path, which way to go. For example, you kind of said like you do prototyping to find out solution, but you sometimes stick to the pipeline. You sometimes don't even go into the way that you start off writing a script. You just try to find, that's how it would sound like, to find a way of, let's say, rename something and then it works pipeline record and you don't have to kind of write a Python script for that. And I noticed this is also like a skill I had to pick up, because a lot of time people like rely on scripting or rely on batching everything. And it's sometimes more about to balance out is when do we need scripting, and when is it sometimes just like rethink the way we approach that.
And we're back.
This is the Sony cameras, by the way, for everyone who knows. It's like have this 30 minutes incredible go off hack. Yeah, you have to hack them to make them work longer. So
nice.
So yeah, I think this is like the thing. I try. That's why I try to just to distinguish exactly the attributes through your stories and through what you describe and through your day, to give someone a hint of what is expected, kind of, what skills do you have to pick up, like actively, like scripting, for example. And again, we both don't say it's like 100% of your day or something. That's not what we say here. But you have to have at least, like, it could happen 30%, 50% sometimes, depends on the day, kind of. And it doesn't have to be the greatest academic, everything has to be perfect scripting, but it has to be this kind of, it gets things done.
Well, fortunately, I had an experience recently to help out at Disney Animation, since they're adopting a USD, as many studios are these days. And going down there, I was so out of my element. Nothing worked the same. Their pipeline is completely different. And it kind of just reminded me that I think one of the main skills of a TD is to be in a pipeline and software environment where you don't know how anything works, figure out how things work, and then fix problems and add new features, which is a hard thing to prepare for. But, it's just, I feel like the buck stops with the TD. You got to figure out why things aren't working or how to get things done. So you just got to be uncomfortable in that unknown, strange software environment. Just figure out how to, measure what's happening, fix it, automate it, etc. So I'm not sure I would know how to recommend how to build that skill per se, but I think just solving problems on your own and making cool art with technical means, it's sort of what we do. And you're inevitably going to run into these problems. So anyway, it was very humbling to go down to Disney and start at zero and figure out how their interesting pipeline works. And it's amazing, but totally different. So
yeah, try to pin down the whole technical directing thing. I think we definitely get a lot from what's needed. Since we were talking about that already, since you mentioned your supervising a leadership role, I would like to go just a little bit to that, because it also involves being a technical director often. Even if you're not a lead, it has this kind of, you're supporting other people, but also in a way that you decide, kind of, even like you sometimes have to decide for them how you want to do that, what they ask of you, and if you want to do it, if it makes even sense, or if it's maybe bunkers kind of way. So I'm interested in the way you approach kind of this leadership thing, where you or like supportship, like whatever you want to call it, is where you sit there and have to decide for other people, and how you manage this to be balanced in a way.
Well, my approach to sort of interacting both with my team as well as other departments is I try to be a nice guy in general. I want to make sure that everyone understands that we're on the same side. If they're running into a technical issue, I'm the good cop. When I roll with my animation soup, he or she is the bad cop. So we can kind of do a good cop, bad cop thing. But in general, my approach tends to be one of sympathy and being nice and trying to figure out what the other person needs, not necessarily how it should be done. Like sometimes someone from another department will say, I want this tool to be able to do that. And it might be something kind of ridiculous. What I try to actually understand is why they're making that request, what they're getting at. Half the time, once I find out the why of the situation, we could find an easier approach that is better for them and easier on our department to implement. So I think I always try to A, be nice, and B, understand the why of the situation in any meeting. And they're often right in what they want, but I always want to understand why.
But how do you balance like between what you need to do and what you need to get out of this kind of like situation and being nice? How did you stay on course? And because in a way, that's the thing, like, you have the background of artistic and technology a lot of times, which if you, for example, talk to an artist, he doesn't, and he sometimes don't understand, and he wants it a specific way. So how do you balance this kind of art, being nice and get to somewhere kind of,
Yeah, I mean, it can be challenging. Sometimes people get, especially when software is crashing on them, they tend not to be in the best of moods. But, I find that's why coming over to people's office can help. Being in a meeting room, sometimes there can be a lot of pressure to stand your ground. But when you're one-on-one in someone's office, you're on the same team. And I often try to just, with them, work out the problem. And actually, often I get just as frustrated as they am. Like, why the hell is it crashing? What's going on here? All right, we're going to get to the bottom of this. And they're actually encouraged by the interactive debugging, because ultimately I can't stand when people are stuck and can't move forward or losing hours. I feel like, we got to fix this. We got to get around. So I'm often on the same page as them. We're on the same team. But meetings can sometimes be a tricky place if the room is big to make requests. But one-on-one, interaction sessions I find can be a little more effective. And again, we're all in the same building. So that makes Pixar, an effective place for this kind of strategy.
Sounds also like the perfect moment for whatever funny hustle story you have. If you want to tell something, because it's always interesting to hear, like even like companies like Pixar or you yourself after 14 years, you collect so many stuff happening to you. So do you have something interesting you want to tell us?
Yeah. So one funny anecdote about when things go wrong as a technical director is, as an intern, again, I alluded to that baked occlusion pipeline where I had a tool where you could bake your ambient occlusion so it can be reused in the next render. One of the processes was to clean up the old file. My silly Mel UI remembered the old file by having some file on disk that kept track of all your occlusion files. That would be read in, be passed as an argument to rm-rf, basically a force remove function on Linux. If that file happened to be empty, it would do rm-rf/, basically wipe your hard drive. And one time I clicked the button, I'm just like, oh man, this is taking a while. What's up with the cleanup script? And all of a sudden the windowing system starts freaking out and I can't log back into my machine. I'm like, how bad did this go? Did this just wipe my local files or did this go further? And I had to, thankfully, it was only limited to my machine and systems was able to restore it. But that was an embarrassment. If you ever do rm-rf, be super careful to measure what you're removing. That is a classic rookie mistake. And so that happened to me. And I have more stories, but I feel like that's one that everyone can relate to potentially. And just keep that in mind. When you're removing files, double check what you're removing.
True. Happened to me too. On my first internship, I deleted stuff. And so the first moment when you start to tell the story, I was wondering, like, are you the Toy Story 2 guy from Creativity Inc.? I was like...
But it could have been. Let's say if the order of the directory, of the order of the Linux mounts was different, it might have started at the global, but it just happened to start local. So it destroyed my OS before I got to the show data.
Yeah, I mean, and you can never control it. And that's the negative part of being like a TD. It's kind of, you have so much power. You can basically create a whole project in one click, which takes like half an hour, and then everything is there, copied, ported, whatever. But in the same way, you do one mistake, it wipes whole shots, scenes, episodes away. So I think this is also a thing I think everyone learns after falling on their noses, is kind of like, stay cool. Like I had the situation where I was freaking out first time, but now it's kind of, the episode is deleted, let's have a look.
Yeah, no, it's true. You definitely become like the surgeon that doesn't freak out when like all this catastrophes are happening. Like files being removed, data loss, it's all part of a day's work. You just got to, show up at the scene of the crime and just start figuring out the evidence and what happened.
True. I want to wrap this up with the last question. I think the question which is like interesting for most people, not even technical director, is like, I mean, we heard your story about how you came up to be there at Pixar. It's probably a little bit different now after 14 years. A lot of things changed. You can read that in Creativity Inc. how the company developed and rebranded itself. So, but today, like if you see around you, your colleagues, even especially the new ones, like what are the things which you would like to advise? Probably even in technical directing sense, sure, for someone who wants to apply for Pixar, and you will say, these are the skills or the mentality or the way I would like to work with you?
Well, that's a big question, but I'll tackle it in a hopefully concise manner. We're a company with a lot of nerdy and artsy people. Just be yourself, be nerdy, be artsy, be passionate about what you do. It's a very comfortable company to be yourself and be a nerd, I find. You don't have to be something you aren't, when you apply. One of the things that keeps my job interesting is that what I do day to day changes year after year, which means don't get too tied to whatever software you're learning to try to do your job, because that's going to change. It's going to be different. What's more important is the skills and the experience you bring. So, don't obsess like, I need to know RenderMan and I need to know Maya and I need to know, all this stuff. And no, be good at what you do. Be passionate about what you do and understand that there's a lot of chance involved. So I encourage everyone to apply, but it's a it's a big industry. One thing I would recommend for TDs in particular, though, I'm going to plug our open source USD initiative. We've been using this for years, but I'm finding it is going gangbusters. So many studios are picking it up and in the process of redeveloping their pipeline around USD. So even though I just said don't worry about specific software, if I would pick something to learn that is not necessarily well understood, I'd say try to get on that USD GitHub repo, get it built on your system, and see if you can start hacking around with it, because that is definitely something that at least at this moment in time is starting to get picked up. So that's my little tip.
Yeah, I tried to use that 3 years ago on my research. It didn't end up well, but it's better now. Try it again. Exactly, it was in the alpha stage. You were my examiner on the Film Academy, and it was not USD in the end. It was dynamic microstructure, because in the alpha stage I couldn't use it. But I hear a lot of good things about now, and it's a mega potential, and I think everyone wants to bite a little bit from this apple now. And so it's a good tip. I think it's a great one. Paul, thank you very much for taking so much time and being here. And by the way, I can see in your background the individualism you described of everyone.
Oh yeah, there's Metallica and Sepultura. You can see, actually I'm going to rotate my camera a little bit so you can see Iron Maiden, Blind Guardian, and Final Fantasy III on my poster. I'm rotating my personal camera. You're not seeing that. But anyway, this is what my wife doesn't allow me to have at home. It's in my office.
That's why, definitely thank you very much. I hope everyone who was listening had a better understanding, now, what is technical director? Maybe people will ask us less silly questions, and they will say oh yeah, guys, we know exactly because we hear this podcast video or whatever. And I hope we could share a little bit light into this position, maybe even in the highest profession as you work for 14 years already, and also show a little bit that it's kind of changing. You kind of fall from one side to another, and you have to adapt yourself to whatever is happening and enjoy the ride a little bit. And you never know what happened in the end, you never know. It will be, you suddenly work there, and 1 year later you in a completely different direction where you wanted to be in originally. So I think this is a lot of things we can get through what you told us.
Awesome, man. Well, it's great chatting. I see our Skype connection is getting poor, so this is probably a good time to call it a day. But it's great chatting with you, man.
Cool. Thank you very much. If you want to find more content, go on alexanderrichtertd.com, subscribe to my YouTube channel, podcast, and email list. Check out my mostly weekly blog and support me by spreading the word and let people know about this content.